You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 313, recorded on June 21st, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, back on the show for this week, is Nate. Hi, Nate.
Great to be here, Bill.
So, Nate, you have been using your quarantine lockdown time from the coronavirus situation to read two books, 20 years apart, on what I guess we might term political genocides in Southeast Asia. Specifically, the first one we'll be talking about is Cambodia. The second one we'll be talking about is a new book on the situation in Indonesia. The reason I say political genocides is because the term genocide itself at the moment does not include mass killings for the purpose of eliminating political opponents. It has to be something like, ethnic or religious or that kind of thing. But there isn't really a good way of conveying it, so we'll call it, for this episode's purpose, political genocides. So these are two obviously significantly different situations in some ways, but obviously having some pretty stark similarities in other ways. As I said, we'll talk first about Cambodia and then about Indonesia. So, Nate, what was the first book that came out back in 2000 that you were going to talk about today?
Yeah, so the first one is First They Killed My Father by Loung Ung, and she was a small child living in Phnom Penh, coming out and was basically forced into the countryside and by the rising Khmer Rouge. And I think she was basically forced to learn how to fight and become like a cadre member at one point. Later escaped as the Vietnamese were invading the country, and they of course eventually overthrow the Khmer Rouge. And sort of tracing her life and how her family was destroyed, scattered all across the world. Several members of it died, obviously, as you can tell from the title. But then there's the search to reconnect with her siblings who managed to survive in various ways. And so just sort of the struggle to survive and then, have that reconciliation after the war. I believe the author is a member of the international campaign to ban landmines. So that's pretty big. And yeah, I mean, this was, there's also a Netflix documentary that they made, or not a documentary, but like a fictionalized version of the story, directed actually by Angelina Jolie, interestingly enough.
That's a more recent one, right? Like, that's why
that
this
was
is
a couple
kind
years
of
ago.
back in the news a little bit, or more,
Yeah, and
more
I saw
current.
that a couple years ago, and I was like, oh yeah, I actually have this book too, because I guess I randomly bought this book because I wanted to read something about Khmer Rouge and the killing fields and all of that, from that kind of narrative on the ground. And so then I saw the movie and was like, okay, well, I should probably read the book at some point. And I was also watching one point during quarantine this Vietnamese YouTuber Luna Oi, and she was recommending this book as well. And I think she goes to Cambodia a fair amount. So like that sort of was one of the reasons that I just picked this up, and definitely a good read, and definitely sort of extremely sad. I was crying by the end of it just because of the tremendous violence that's inflicted on this poor family. And so yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the most pleasant read. There's some really, really sad parts where she's sort of imagining the methods in which her parents were killed, and because they were taken and disappeared in the night, and that's something we'll probably talk about because that's a common feature that happens and sort of had started spreading as a result of these political genocides, as we talked about. And, there's some controversy over, is it actual genocide, political genocide, because there are some ethnic component in both of these, particularly targeted of people who are of Chinese heritage. And, so that plays a role in it as well. So, but yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about Cambodia and the situation at the time. This is a period especially 1975 to 1979, when the Khmer Rouge was more or less completely in control. Khmer Rouge would basically be, translate to like Red Cambodia, and officially it was the Communist Party of Kampuchea, meaning Cambodia, but in many ways, they are completely outliers to almost all of the rest of sort of communist and Cold War history. They are not particularly communist, despite their official label of being communist, and they were toppled by the communist regime of Vietnam that intervened to stop this. And without that intervention, it's almost unimaginable how much farther they would have gone in their killing campaign. They managed to kill well over 1 million people in that period alone, but that could have certainly continued if that had been allowed to persist. The other thing is that despite being this allegedly and still regarded in popular culture today as this like ultra brutal hardline communist regime, they obviously weren't that communist even at the time, because they were being actively supported by some of the Western governments, at least covertly. So could you talk a little bit about that context?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting because, yeah, as you mentioned, Pol Pot is held up as sort of like, along with Stalin, the sort of the communist, and all of the death and destruction flows from this, and this idea is sort of is interesting to think about, though, because as you mentioned, there's if that were true, then the conflicts between other Marxist-Leninists or similar states such as Vietnam, you think that wouldn't happen there. So I'm just looking just a little bit about the history of Khmer Rouge and their sort of Marxist thought. And I guess there was sort of a turn within the French Communist Party in the 50s, and it sort of like went to this like very Stalinist or like post-Leninist ideology that threw in elements of Stalinism, Maoism, even like stuff from like Frantz Fanon, post-colonial theories, things like that. They were also looking at this will be funny for people on the internet, Enver Hoxha's Albania. They thought that was the most advanced communist state then in existence. A lot of looking at the Great Leap Forward and the emphasis on the rural peasantry. So, yeah, I mean, there's sort of an eclectic hodgepodge of things going on here, but there was also a lot of, I guess it was like an ultranationalism with idealization of the Angkor Empire, which lasted for about 800 to 1430. So, yeah, this leads to all sorts of various implications that I guess we saw play out.
This nationalist character, and I think we'll definitely circle back to this when we talk about Indonesia. It seems like in a lot of these countries, especially being tied up with this sort of post-colonial period and that kind of thing, right? This decolonization process. Most of the left movements around the world had at least some element of a national project when we're talking about this decolonization. In the case of Cambodia, we're largely talking about emerging from French Indochina, as Vietnam had done. But the question is like how far that nationalist element is emphasized. And in many ways, it seems like rather than being some sort of a extremely political leftist project, this was much more of a right-wing project, which is why it seemed to find sympathy in some ways. I mean, there were probably other reasons, but that's probably one reason why it found some sympathy with some of the more right-wing elements of, kind of the first world intelligence efforts and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, there's different types of nationalism that, we should think about, and we'll probably get more into it as we discuss Indonesia. But Sukarno, the leader there who was eventually overthrown in the mass violence that we'll talk about, he was sort of like the founding father of Indonesia and basically created a nationalism or helped create a nationalism where, you wouldn't think there was one particular overriding pre-existing nationalism. Of course, Indonesia, lots of different islands, lots of different languages, various ethnic groups. And so that was sort of, he managed to, and including like the language that was sort of adopted as a national language was not sort of the Javanese language. But so there were attempts to create like a more inclusive Indonesia. But I feel like in the example of with the Khmer Rouge, it was because of, there was a lot of Vietnamese, there were still a Vietnamese fighters, I guess, and there was a lot of anti-Vietnamese sentiment, including several pogroms. And in power, the Khmer Rouge also targeted Chinese, Vietnamese, I guess also the Cham minority. And they talk about this in the book as well, because the family is, I believe, part Chinese. And so, yeah, it seems like that's a bit of a different like theory of the nationalism than espoused by Sukarno.
Right, and certainly in Indonesia, you had bits and pieces of like, hey, we should have control of Malaysia when the British leave, that kind of thing, in terms of an expansionist agenda, but it was relatively constrained, whereas, as you say, the Khmer Rouge had this obsession with the Khmer Empire or the Angkor Empire that, at various points included most of, or large sections of what are today Thailand, Laos, parts of Vietnam. This was a much larger sort of geographical area than Cambodia in the 1970s. So there's the potential there that this was possibly going to be quite expansionist. Why do you think though that this allegedly like kind of pseudo-Stalinist regime or whatever was going to be supported by, like, say, Margaret Thatcher and so forth? I mean, it's again, because of the popular culture today is like, Pol Pot's this, like, evil leftist who killed 1 million people or whatever. And again, it seems like it has a lot more to do with the Vietnamese politics. Yeah. Well, if you can talk about the Cold War now, that's fine.
Right, but, like, just in terms of the historical memory, it seems like people think it was a very clean black, white, good, evil struggle. And obviously that's been reinforced by media ever since. But as we'll talk about Indonesia, there was a large group of countries that were part of the non-aligned movement. And there was the whole Bandung conference that sort of was heralding the spirit of the non-aligned. At that point, the term third world was not like a derogative. It was like, no, we are the non USSR dichotomy. We exist beyond that, and we're going to, throw off the shackles of colonialism and try to, create a new world for ourselves. But the problem was the U.S. saw any sort of deviation from their world order that they wanted to be extremely dangerous. So there are all these attempts to overthrow Sukarno, overthrow all these other leaders who, at best were maybe like social democrats. The book talks a lot about what was going on in Guatemala, in Brazil, Chile. So I think then with the Khmer Rouge, you just have a situation where I think there's been various diplomatic cables that have come up about this, but it was just that was the more pragmatic thing because it was a check, I guess, on Vietnam. So yeah. And I think China was also supporting Khmer Rouge at certain points. So it's
right.
It's
well, China was having its own struggle with Vietnam at the time. Yeah. No, it's not really... as you say, it's not a clean cut. It's like a complicated morass.
Have you ever looked at the Wikipedia entry on the Biafra War?
Yeah, that one's another complicated one.
All the people on like both sides, like Israel's on one side, like along with China, and then like U.S. on the other side. It's crazy, but yeah.
Another one, Angola, was a relatively complicated one as well.
Right, because the various, like, China was funding some militia groups and the Cubans were funding other militia groups. So,
right. So eventually the killing stops in Cambodia because in 1978, Pol Pot invades Vietnam. Now, his pretext for this was, they're going to invade me if I don't invade them. Although, again, with that sort of nationalist project, who knows? The Vietnamese perspective was that they were very upset with the huge numbers of refugees that kept coming in from Cambodia to their country because people were trying to get out of the way of this horribly genocidal regime. And so at the turn of end of 1978 and early 1979, in a pretty quick operation, the Vietnamese armed forces and their ally Cambodian forces, anti-Khmer Rouge forces, counter-invade and basically take the capital and establish their own thing, which the international community was like, this is a puppet government of Vietnam, which I guess, but
well,
an improvement over the situation. Yeah.
It's funny that there was a point where the Khmer Rouge was the international recognized government by the West. That's crazy to think about.
Right. And at the United Nations, they got to keep their seat for a while at the United Nations.
And then until, going back to the Thatcher, Thatcher said in '88, So you'll find the more reasonable ones of the Khmer Rouge will have some part to play in the future government, but only a minority part. I share your utter horror that these terrible things went on Kampuchea. Okay. And I guess Sweden changed its vote in the UN and withdrew its support from the Khmer Rouge after many Swedish citizens wrote letters to their elected representatives demanding a policy. So this is like the U.S. Recognizing like Juan Guaido right now, basically. But like Juan Guaido hasn't killed like millions of people, so yet.
All right, so let's talk about the other book now, because I think, as you say, a lot of this, like, if you know, it's hard to understand the rest of the Cold War without understanding some of the things that are being uncovered more recently in Indonesia and related countries after Indonesia's example, in terms of, there's recently declassified documents, there's additional research, there's more, interviews with people and so forth. And this is one that remains still very current in many cases, in many ways, because people are still feeling the effects in Indonesia and are not really still even that comfortable. I mean, they're able to talk about what happened sort of, but like there's still, a lot of these people are still officially kind of considered to be outcasts or ostracized for having been victims, not for having been the perpetrators. So the next book is The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder That Shaped Our World by Vincent Bevins. It's out very recently. You read this book. I listened to several interviews with Vincent Bevins about the book, and you read some of the book reviews as well, in addition to having actually read the book. This has been flying off the shelves. I think they've already gone to a third printing. Everyone seems to be just fascinated by this. And a core point of this, and this is something that happened in 1965. So, 10 plus years before what we were just talking about. It's called the Jakarta Method because this was then exported to all of these other countries as part of later U.S.-backed operations in the Cold War. So I guess quickly start off by summarizing what happened in Indonesia initially before we talk about how it sort of was exported.
Yeah, and this is sort of right up my alley in the sense that I'd previously done research on parts of what was going on, not the actual massacres itself, but a U.S. attempt to overthrow.
I think we did an episode on this show, actually, as well, about that.
Yeah, well, we've definitely talked about this before, so some of this will cross over, but this is just, one of our hobby horses, I guess, that we can go back to because, it's continually relevant, and there's more stuff that comes out about it, of course. So I know we did an episode on the act of killing and the look of silence at one point. So the story, as it goes, is sort of traces the history of Indonesia during the 50s and its relationship with the U.S. government, and of course Sukarno, his sort of work. At one point, he was imprisoned by the Japan. He was imprisoned, I think, by the Dutch, and then later by the Japanese. And he was working with the Japanese just to make sure that they didn't kill all the Indonesians. So then he sort of becomes the founding father of Indonesia, as we discussed a little bit about the language. Vincent Bevins goes a fair amount into the various different types of political Islam in Indonesia, and of course the rise of the PKI, Indonesian Communist Party, and also it's sort of a women's auxiliary group, the Gurwani, I believe it's called, which I believe was the largest women's rights organization or women's group in the world at that time, because obviously Indonesia is a pretty populous country, and the PKI was, I believe, one of the largest communist parties in the world at that time, outside of, I believe, China.
Yeah, China, the Soviet Union, and then Indonesia, I think.
Yeah. So, this is sizable. And I did a lot of research, actually, at the National Archives, going through various CIA documents about the PKI, and, they were quite concerned about its, continuing popularity, and they probably would have won elections had they been able to be held. But I think what's also worth noting, and Bevins talks about this a lot, is the PKI was it was non-violent. It was more parliamentary communist party, not armed
he
cadres.
described it in interviews as non-cadre, non-Maoist, and that it was old school Marxism, even pre-Russian Revolution style Marxism, where the objective is that you run in parliamentary elections, that you help build up sort of the bourgeois industrial economy of your country, and then you transition into communism. And one of the interesting interviews, he said this was intended to be a 50-plus year project where Indonesia would become a communist state circa the year 2000, which is sort of weird to think about, of course, now. But at the time, 1965, you'd say, okay, this is, by this date, we're going to achieve, an industrial base. And by this date, we're going to achieve communism. And then by this date, et cetera, et cetera. That was
that was the
theory.
working theory for a while, like pre-Russian Revolution. And I believe the Indonesian Communist Party was founded by a Dutch Marxist who was, in Indonesia. And so it's like, this is like a type of communism that's like predates Leninism. So it's a little bit different. But then also he talks about there were certain points, I believe in like the 20s, where the official like line coming out of Moscow, and I think also like from the Chinese Communist Party at a certain time was like, oh, actually it's fine, work with like the bourgeois elements within society to like build up and then make the transition to socialism.
Obviously, this sort of pacifist, disarmed nature of Indonesian communism, while viewed as some sort of a huge threat to U.S. interests, was not particularly threatening within Indonesia, and also therefore not really able to defend itself when trouble eventually hits.
Right. So, there's like a buildup of conflict between the United States and Indonesia, and a lot of it ties to economic factors, whether it's oil, palm oil, gold, which was a lot of discovered in, I believe, East Timor, rubber, and so there was talk of potentially Sukarno might nationalize U.S. oil companies at one point, and the U.S. was like extremely upset about this. Basically, they would withdraw all their support, and so the book cites another historian that I like, follow on Twitter, and I've read some of his books, Bradley Simpson, Economists with Guns. I believe we actually mentioned this on the show before, Thorian Developments in U.S.-Indonesian Relationships, 1960-1968. And there's basically like a Berkeley mafia of economists comes down, similar to what we saw in Chile with the U Chicago boys. So there's, a very serious push to actually, integrate, these countries and get their resources for the U.S. marketplace. And right after the coup in 65, they have a lot of different companies come in. So after the first year, after Suharto's fully consolidated rule, which we should talk about how that happens, but General Electric, American Express, Caterpillar, Goodyear Tire all came in. Starkist Foods was fishing in Indonesian waters. And, of course, defense contractors Raytheon and, of course, Lockheed as well popped in. So they were open for business. Freeport Mining, yeah, that's the big mine in West New Guinea, where they have just tons of minerals, the largest mine in the world. And I believe the Indonesians recently took it over. But basically, yeah, before we get too distracted on the timeline, the U.S. tries to overthrow Sukarno in 1958. And this is what I did research on in Operation Hake, I believe is also called Operation Archipelago. But they basically funded a group of like sort of dissident generals and colonels and such. And so they tried to start a separatist movement, but considering that like these were also sort of right-wing generals, and it just ended up being like U.S. trained right-wing generals fighting with each other. And there was also the highly embarrassing situation where a CIA pilot was shot down after having like dropped bombs on a marketplace, and was quickly exposed. This guy Alan Pope was quickly exposed as CIA, and basically sort of completely discredited the movement. And yeah, I mean, this was sort of an early attempt at overthrowing governments, and I guess they didn't quite have it down pat.
So eventually they keep kind of working on building up the tensions and so forth, but there's also a significant policy change when Lyndon Johnson becomes the U.S. president. It seems like a lot of this also, which I didn't really hear as much in these interviews that Bevins was doing, it has to be looked at in the context of also what's happening in Vietnam at the same time, right?
Well, yeah, and Bevins talks a little bit about how Vietnam had also like post 1965, because Indonesia, in a lot of people's thoughts, was like the domino that they could not let fall. And once the massacres start, it seems like they had already basically won that domino, and the domino would not fall, so they could effectively let Vietnam fall without completely like jeopardizing their world order. So, I mean, I think that was a big part of it, because that's where a ton of the resources were. The population is much larger than Vietnam, so I guess they sort of felt that they could let that one go. But yeah.
Well, yeah, like obviously what they ended up doing in Indonesia is much less resource intensive than doing a full-scale Vietnam-style war, which the U.S. sort of inherited the situation in Vietnam from the French anyway. I mean, they could have opted out, but like that was partly how that situation arrived differently than this sort of more hands-off, I guess, approach, or behind-the-scenes approach is a better way of putting it, in Indonesia. And of course, as you say, like Indonesia is continuing to expand in this time too. I mean, there's the kind of clashes between Sukarno and the British over the decolonization of Malaysia, and that
the confrontation.
He's saying that we should get Malaysia. It's part of this archipelago. This should be part of Indonesia. The British are saying no. The U.S. don't want to alienate their British allies. Also, at the same time, while the 1949 is when most of Indonesia achieves independence, you just mentioned about all the resources in West New Guinea, which would be basically Dutch New Guinea, that was not part of it, right? Originally, it was 1949 to 1962. It was this like sort of devolved colony of the Netherlands still, or something, and then eventually it was transferred. So in 1962, Indonesia again grows in size.
Right, the New York Agreement, it was called, and it was brokered under the Kennedy administration. Eventually, they got it back, and then of course we could talk later about East Timor and everything. But yeah.
But so walk me through, though, what the policy change under Johnson, and then, as you said, the domino theory was originally not really about Vietnam. It was about this idea that this huge domino in the form of Indonesia was going to fall to communism, even though, as we've talked about, this was a different form of communism than, say, Mao's communism or Stalin's communism or anything like that, and that if this were to fall, this would cause all these other problems. So they start working on, as you said, there had been earlier like coup attempts that were not successful, but they start this sort of like strategy of trying to target Sukarno, and eventually they are successful in removing him.
We should talk about the actual sort of big thing here, the whole September 30 movement, and it's still a bit unknown. And Bevins says, he doesn't know himself, but like what exactly happened that caused. So what happened was there was a movement called September 30th movement of sort of junior officers within the military that basically kidnapped a bunch of the higher ranking generals. And kidnapping was sort of a thing that like happened in Indonesia. Like you could kidnap some guys and then like later you might still all be friends. It was sort of like
kind of like Magna Carta kidnapping, right? Tie the king to a tree and get them to do something.
Right, and I guess Sukarno himself was kidnapped at one point. But what happened with these the generals who got kidnapped, except for of course Suharto, and it's unclear, maybe he had some involvement in all this. But yeah, it was just they were kidnapped. Then later they were found all killed at the bottom of a well, and then this was seized on by the right, because the reason for the coup happening was the thought that there was a coup that was about to happen from the right. And the coup plotters, the September 30th movement, were basically saying, okay, well, we're now safeguarding democracy. We're safeguarding Sukarno and his guided democracy movement, which was what was called at the time. He made some changes in the power structure, but whatever it was that was what they said they were doing. And then it was taken by the right and basically said, actually, there were the witches from the Gurwani movement did satanic rituals on it, and this is still the official line, and it's in the museums and everything. There's a special museum for like the victims of communism in Indonesia, so that's still the official story. And basically, I don't think you can go to that museum if you're a Westerner. But it's still unclear what happened, why were they killed, was that the plan at the beginning?
So this alleged kidnapping of conservative generals by communists, purportedly. and then killed in satanic rituals, which is false, but that was the official line. This then becomes the pretext to for this right-wing general Suharto to seize power. Now, the U.S. had already taken various preparations, changed the ambassador. They brought in a guy who had participated in the 1962 military coup in South Korea. And this was a specialist guy who was going to help facilitate this. So Suharto then, because he mysteriously wasn't kidnapped by this alleged September 30th movement, he then, to defend himself or whatever, he seizes control, and this is when the process of mass killings begins very quietly.
And, the best parts of this book, I think, are the interviews that he does with some of the survivors who remain to this day still ostracized in their communities. But, people that were just they were like a teacher or a farmer, and their teachers union or farming organization had ties to the PKI. So they basically turned themselves in willingly in some circumstances, I'll just go down to the station, have a chat, and then they get thrown in jail. And then a bunch of their other, their friends get thrown in there with them. And at first, things seem okay. They're singing songs together. It's we'll get through this. And then, their friends are just, one by one are taken away, and then they just never see them again. And that sort of begins the process of disappearing, where people would be killed, but there would be no announcement, or they would never tell the families or anything like that. So it was part of a strategy of sort of demoralizing and weakening people, because it's one thing if someone gets killed and you can react to that, but then it's sort of different if you're paralyzed with uncertainty and fear and not knowing what happened. So
right. Well, one thing Bevins talks about a lot is that they were very careful, unlike many past mass killings and genocides. And he also contrasts this with some incidents in rural areas of Latin America, which we've talked about on the show before as well, where they would just go, gun down an entire village or whatever. They were they were relatively careful in Indonesia to do a lot of these killings, extrajudicial killings, at night, to hide the bodies or throw them in the ocean or the river or whatever, in some way that the evidence wasn't going to be there for people to say, oh, my relative who's missing is dead. And the consequence of that is that, and also, as we're talking about with these interviews with survivors, not everyone was killed. Some people were taken in for long periods and then released. The cumulative consequence of that policy was essentially to make it so that nobody was resisting, because they thought, well, surely my relative is still alive somewhere, and as long as I cooperate and keep my head down and don't make a fuss about it, I will be reunited with my dad or my uncle or my brother or whatever. And that was not the case, but you don't know that at the time. And this was also unprecedented. Now we know all about disappearances around the world as a Cold War policy. And part of the thesis of this book, backed up with evidence, is that this was very explicitly being exported as the Jakarta Method, that various right-wing anti-capitalist forces and intelligence agencies would go around training people on how to do this after it worked so effectively in Indonesia, where they were able to take this absolutely massive but not armed communist party that everyone had some tie to, and they were able to completely marginalize and sideline them and totally break their power so that they had almost no remaining influence in relatively short order. And the key strategy here was the strategy of disappearances, which then becomes popular in so many other countries. As long as you can keep a lid on it and dispose of all these people without people realizing what's happening, then you can get away with it for a long time. And because this wasn't an armed communist party, they didn't really have an effective way of rising up to resist any of this, even if they had understood what was happening initially.
Yeah, exactly. And also, just looking at something from the book here, tying our two discussions in, I believe Pol Pot was watching what happened to the PKI, and then I think some people think that sort of accelerated his turn, or just being like, we need to go full on ultra violence because we've saw where the other strategy took us. So, but I think another part of this that I didn't quite as know as much going into it with the amount of people that were still held in concentration camps well after the situation or the sort of spasm of mass killing that happened over the course of, I believe it was only a couple months.
And we're talking, by the way, for context, we're talking about minimum hundreds of thousands of people dying and as many as maybe 2 million people being killed in relatively short order, very quietly, which is
I've
astonishing
heard
to think.
as many as 3 million, but no, I mean, it's incredible. And there's also like just the descriptions and the places where people were killed and some of these, like on the beaches in Bali. Like you can go to the beaches now and it's like extremely fancy resorts and stuff, but like they were just stacking bodies on the beach.
And as the we
like
talked
people
about,
were washing up in the rivers. And
we talked about before the documentary semi-dramatization, The Act of Killing, that a lot of these people, the perpetrators, as with some of the survivors still being around and available for interviews, many of the perpetrators are available for interviews and willing to talk about what they did and, you know, how they strangled people to death and or cut their, you know, garroted them or what, you know, that kind of thing, right? Like, even though this was being carried out quietly and in secret, it's also this huge non-secret in many ways.
Yeah, and so here's
at least after the fact.
Well, for the people in the act of killing were like, I think they were like a motorcycle gang. Like people were like deputized into it, and like some were threatened. Yeah, basically like if you don't kill the communists, we're gonna kill you. But there was also, I think, people like they just got people to just do their bidding who were sort of were fine with that anyway. So a read a passage was like, the armed forces did not oversee the extermination of every single communist, alleged communist, and potential communist sympathizer in the country. That would have been nearly impossible because nearly a quarter of the country was affiliated somehow with the PKI. Once the killings took hold, it became increasingly hard to find anyone who would admit any association with the PKI. Around 15% of the prisoners were women. They were subjected to especially cruel gendered violence, which sprung directly from the propaganda spread by Suharto with Western help. Many instances of rape, mutilation, you know, it just some of the most disgusting things that you can imagine are happening. And these tactics have been exported, especially when we're talking about what happened in Chile and in Brazil. And, you know, these things keep popping up. So this is sort of, you know, on the one hand, you sort of like want to look away from the brutality and the violence, but at the same point, like you can't, like you have to take it in. So
let's talk about that export process, because that is obviously, I mean, you know, that's the key innovation that this book brings to the research. I mean, yes, there's new research on the actual events surrounding the coup d'etat. There's more information and interviews with people that survived or were familiar with what happened in the actual spasm of killing. But then the key sort of development here is how closely tied this was to the rest of what happened in the Cold War in so many other countries. That other regimes and right-wing paramilitary forces directly copied this down to calling it the Jakarta Method or Operation Jakarta or things like that, that they were going to do this. You know, I think Bevins said in one interview that you would sometimes see spray-painted threats of Jakarta is coming, as, you know, a way of warning people that they were about to start this process of disappearing and mass killing.
Yeah, I mean, it was very explicit, and seems like that was sort of the point where it's like, okay, we're going to terrorize you. We're going to basically make you incapable of fighting back or not really being able to do anything. And similar to the whole disappearances thing, where that was extremely famous part of what was going on with the whole dirty war in Latin America generally, but Argentina, I think especially. I don't think Bevins talks as much about Argentina in the book. His focus is on Brazil. I believe he's based out of there as a journalist, so that would make sense. And he brings a lot of good stuff, and you know, because there's the whole Brazilian like juntas and everything was like quite complicated, and he went deep into the weeds in a couple interviews that I listened to about with him. But yeah, but there were at certain points these tactics were used, and of course. It's probably better known in Chile with everything that happened after Allende was overthrown and Pinochet comes in. And of course, you know, the Jakarta Method survives as memes that the right wing constantly uses when they talk about helicopters and throwing people out of helicopters. Like, well, okay, this is part of the mass killing. This is the techniques that were used, the death flights,
Right. If you
Just
fly a helicopter with a political prisoner out over the Pacific Ocean and drop them in so they're never found, that is doing the
that's
Jakarta method,
that's
basically.
disappearance. Yeah, it's like there were lots of there was what is it the disappeared, the mothers of the disappeared. That's like a whole movement, or was for post Dirty War, and there's of course still more and more stuff that comes up about it, but going into like extremely discussed like various torture methods, or using like rape involving animals, just like some of the most vile things you could possibly come up with. But yeah, I mean, these tactics were used all across Latin America. They talk a lot about Operation Condor, assassination networks, the DINA, the Chilean Secret Service, who they did a car bomb assassination in the middle of DC. They blew up like Orlando Letelier, I believe, and a young woman who was like from a left-wing think tank. They just killed him, middle of DC.
Yeah, they were quite blatant about a lot of this, which I think is also another reason why, as you kind of alluded to there, there's been a lot more focus on the Latin American side of this, even though it comes from Indonesia. I mean, for one thing, there's obviously much closer ties between the United States and American people in general to many Latin American populations, but there's also various activist groups trying to find out what happened to people who disappeared, whereas, as we talked about in Indonesia, it is very much just not discussed, and the people who were the victims are not seen as victims. They are seen as people who probably should have been killed as well by many people, right? That that they got lucky somehow, but that they shouldn't have, because they were part of this satanic communism or whatever, because the regime lasted for so long in Indonesia. And even after the quote-unquote transition to democracy, I mean, the military's presence in Indonesian politics is so omnipresent. A lot of the presidents are former generals and so forth, and under the so-called democratic period of Indonesia. Whereas in Latin America, there have been, although it's swinging back in the other direction, there was a period of liberal or social democratic or whatever rule after these military regimes that was more amenable to having not quite truth and reconciliation style self-examinations, but some sort of a process and some sort of a civil push from society to try to address what had happened and whether people who disappeared, were killed. I mean, basically, yeah,
Right.
if they didn't ever come back, they were killed. But
Well,
what
I
happened
mean,
to them?
it's especially stark because just looking at Brazil, it's like, okay, you have Dilma Rousseff, who was tortured. I believe she was a guerrilla, during this period, and was tortured. And of course, Bolsonaro has like given speeches praising her torturer and like basically saying like we should have fully implemented the Jakarta method and killed like everyone. So this is still like very much on the surface, which makes this even more timely.
And we've certainly talked recently about on an episode I think last year about Elliot Abrams still kicking around in Washington as an active player, even though he was overseeing some of these absolutely brutal massacres of indigenous peoples in places like Guatemala. And there's so many examples. And then another thing, like with Bolsonaro, another current day example, of course, you have the president of the Philippines, Duterte, just saying, not so much talking about communists, but saying, we've got to just go out there and kill all of the criminals. And, I would kill, 1.5 million with my bare hands if I could. And everyone should go out and kill the drug dealers and all that. Like, I think very similar sort of just open glorification of these completely extrajudicial mass murders, but in many ways the key defining thing that's especially different in, say, Indonesia compared to the places it was later implemented in South America is this role of just bringing in, as you said, biker gangs or just random thugs. Like, it wasn't just the military or the police doing a lot of these crimes. It was a lot of just incorporating just random people that you could get on board with this agenda of just slaughtering people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much we want to transition into talking about what's going on now with various protest movements and state violence, police violence here in America, but you do see some of those auxiliary types, or like there was, I believe it was in Albuquerque. There was one of those types of guys who like shot a protester.
Just sort of self-appointed
Yeah,
paramilitaries from the right. And then, of course, the very mysterious string of deaths that started in 2014 and has certainly accelerated over the past several weeks in 2020 of people who were
love to.
involved with anti-police protests or protests against police conduct, just dying under extremely mysterious and implausible scenarios
Yeah,
that are allegedly all suicides.
love to commit suicide by setting my car on fire and shooting myself in the head inside of it.
I
But
guess
I
we'll
mean,
leave that at that for that.
yeah,
Yeah, so I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about is just sort of the overall Cold War picture that Bevins is very careful to contextualize this within. I mean, some of this is definitely the Americans not really understanding until after the Cold War was over and KGB files were being declassified and that sort of thing, that the Russians were not really doing this kind of thing. I mean, there's definitely a few kind of outlier examples that you'll hear about, like, oh, such and such communist regime killed a bunch of political opponents, but the perception or the propaganda line, at least during the Cold War, was like, oh well, this is just the nature of the game. You know, we're going tit for tat and matching all of the Soviet
spy
backed
versus
atrocities
spy.
with American backed atrocities, and this is all fine as long as we win in the end. And we did, I guess, quote unquote, win in the end. But how do you see this as sort of? I mean, how should we view this in retrospect now that we know that, like, and it wasn't necessarily that the Soviets were not doing things out of the goodness of their heart or whatever, but also just because, like, the Americans seem to have overestimated how strong the Soviet Union was coming out of World War II.
Well, the KGB is always seems way cooler in American media than it actually was, and I mean, I guess you could make the critique or whatever that the KGB and various Soviet, it was more focused on internal repression than like meddling in other countries, like, you know. So I mean,
Well,
there
and
was some of that.
the the whole, I mean, in addition to domino theory, the whole thing under Truman of containment doctrine, which then becomes this guiding principle that's this desperate push by the U.S. military and secret intelligence services to, like, oh, we have to contain the spread of communism and keep these dominoes from falling, as they later termed it. In retrospect, that just wasn't happening. Like, for the most part, the Soviets and even the Chinese were routinely trying to tell their various partners to, like, dial it back or be careful not to alienate the United States. And even as Bevins talks about, Allende in Chile tried very hard to follow all the rules and try to be the good leftist who wasn't doing any sort of repressions or anything that could be used as a pretext against him. And that itself became a problem, much in the same way that the pacifist electoral parliamentarian focused communists in Indonesia, they also didn't do anything wrong and weren't a threat, but they were perceived as a threat that then had to be crushed with brutal force. Allende's government became a threat inherently because it might have served, had it succeeded, as a model for successful democratic socialism. And that was enough for the United States under Nixon to decide he absolutely had to be crushed. And I think it's interesting now that we know, especially with even further hindsight, now that we're well past the end of the Cold War at this point, I guess basically 30 years now, it is clear that the communists were not pushing particularly hard, and there wasn't this containment issue that the U.S. was so obsessed with.
Yeah, just want to read from the last chapter of the book where he's interviewing a guy who's the head of this small organization advocating for the survivors of the violence, 65 United 65 Secretariat, and he goes, the U.S. won. Here in Indonesia, you got what you wanted, and around the world, you got what you wanted. The Cold War was a conflict between socialism and capitalism won. Moreover, we got all the U.S.-centered capitalism that Washington wanted to spread. Just look around you, he said, gesturing to his city and the entire Indonesian archipelago around him. How did we win? I asked. When Arso stopped fidgeting. You killed us. Answers like that were very common. And, I mean, that's there's no understating that. There's no way to get around it, really, and it's just not talked about in most media discussions of the Cold War, or even historical discussions, really. Like, a lot of the stuff is known to historians, but, like, they don't really focus on it because, like, it doesn't make you feel good, I guess. Like, the idea that, like, oh, yeah, we won the Cold War because we just, like, started stacking bodies and, like, killing and, like, raping millions of people. That doesn't make us feel good about America, so we don't really like to focus on it.
And I think like the key point here is that the long time propaganda explanation, when it was even acknowledged about how much brutality there was just always to say, well, the Russians were doing that too on the other side. And as it turns out, they really weren't. Or at least the scale of it was so much less. As you say, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, there was very significant repression within the Soviet Union, and a lot of people, being mass murdered there at various points, although more before the Cold War, especially. But the idea that this was some sort of a tit-for-tat project all over the world, and that, there was, for every massacre of an indigenous village in some Central American country, you could find a massacre of, I guess, pro-capitalist village somewhere else. Like that, that's just not really the case. And that it's not like, because I think that, there used to be a joke about the Cold War was a race between the United States and the Soviet Union to see who could bankrupt themselves first, and the Soviets won, but just barely. And now that we're 30 years past, that is such a hollow joke, because not only did the U.S. not come close to bankrupting itself, I mean, it's absolutely laughable to think about the obsession with a $300 billion budget deficit in, say, the 1984 election or whatever, compared to the trillions of dollars now. The Soviets did basically bankrupt themselves more or less, trying to keep up with us on certain fronts. But one area that they were just not keeping up with us was on the sort of spread of their ideology and material support. And a lot of that was because they knew that they couldn't take us on and win. And they were afraid, and they didn't want to risk their own project that they had established, and were trying to secure in their own country by promoting world revolution everywhere, despite the official propaganda line. There were a few exceptions here and there where they were able to give support, but that's also why you see, for example, Cuba providing so much support in Angola, outsized compared to its own actual size. Like, Cuba's a small country, and yet they were able to provide more material support in many ways than some of these other much bigger power players. And that was because that was the interest that they had. That was that they decided on their own policy course there in many ways. And as you say, a lot of this book and the interviews that Bevins did with survivors is this idea that they're haunted by this future that might have been for a country like Indonesia, right? And it didn't come to pass because of this absolutely brutal smackdown of any sort of peaceful efforts to bring a new democratic, truly democratic tradition that also, enacted significant economic reforms and brought a new way of living and sharing all these bountiful natural resources that a country like Indonesia has.
Right. Well, the decade from 1955, where the Bandung Conference happened, and to 65, that was a period of, I think, a lot of hope for Indonesians, and they're like, okay, we're actually going to start, creating a world that we want to live in now that, we're no longer occupied by the Japanese, we're no longer colonized by the Dutch, and we've traced what happens. It's just absolutely tragic, and you see that from the people that survived, and it's like, we once had this vision of what we could do as a non-aligned, independent state or nation, group of people, and reality quickly imposed itself. So. But then also, as we're talking about with the Russia stuff, I think what's very important to remember, we're talking about these massacres that took place all across the world during the Cold War, is that the victims, it would still be noteworthy, but it would be perhaps different if there were these pitched battles and it's CIA versus KGB or Spetsnaz or whatever. But the people that are being killed are, as we talked about, farmers, teachers, just peasants, indigenous people who, sometimes were disappeared if they were in the cities. The book talks about a bit, like in Chile. If you were urban intellectual, you had to be disappeared. But if you were a villager, indigenous, perhaps in Guatemala somewhere, you and your entire village were just massacred, and they didn't even bother hiding it. So seeing a lot of different strategies play out all over the place.
All right. Well, Nate, thank you so much for coming back on the show this week to talk about two different books. The one on Cambodia was First They Killed My Father by Loung Ung, and second was the new book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder That Shaped Our World by Vincent Bevins, which is out now.
Thanks a lot, Bill.